Imagine a head, not just any head, but the head of a saint, John the Baptist. Now imagine a second head, also claimed to be his, resting in a cathedral hundreds of miles away. And then a third. This wasn't a miracle. It was a business. A dark, fantastically profitable trade that shaped the medieval world, built empires, and was often orchestrated from the shadows of the church itself. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe. Tonight, in Bedtime History, we'll uncover this secret world. We'll step into the forger's workshop, witness the greatest holy heist in history, and ask why so many wanted to believe a beautiful lie. So settle in, relax, and let's travel back to a time of gilded faith and masterfully crafted deception. Let us begin by painting a picture of that world. A world lit mostly by firelight and the moon. Imagine the deep, profound darkness of a moonless night, far from the glow of any city we would know. The world felt enormous and full of secrets. The forests were deep and ancient. The winters were long and terribly cold. For most people, life was a cycle of hard work, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. It was a life of submission to your Lord, to the seasons, and above all, to God. There was a raw uncertainty to everything. A sickness could claim a family. A bad harvest could mean starvation. And a simple storm could feel like a sign of divine anger. In this world, faith was not a private, philosophical matter. It was the very fabric of reality. The spiritual world was not separate from the physical one. It was layered right on top of it, and often broke through. Angels and demons were not just ideas. They were active participants in daily life. A sudden fortune could be a blessing from a saint. A shadow moving at the edge of your vision could be a lurking devil. God was an all-powerful king, and the saints were his heavenly court. They were intermediaries, powerful friends in high places who could intercede on your behalf. You just needed a way to get their attention, a way to make your small voice heard in the vastness of heaven. This is where the holy relics came in. A relic was a physical object, a tangible piece of the divine. It was a direct line to the holy. The most powerful or first-class relics, a part of a saint's body, a bone, a lock of hair, a drop of blood. Below that were second-class relics, an item the saint owned or frequently used, like their clothing or a book. Finally, third-class relics were objects that had simply touched a first-class relic. Think of it like a divine battery. The saint's holiness was a charge, and these objects held that charge. To be near a relic, to see it, to touch it, was to be near the saint themselves. It was the closest one could get to heaven while still on earth. For this reason, people would travel immense distances on journeys called pilgrimages. They would walk for weeks or even months, facing bandits and bad weather. They would sleep in humble inns or on the floors of monasteries, all for a single purpose: to arrive at a great cathedral or a tiny chapel and stand before its sacred treasure. Imagine the feeling after such a long journey. You enter the cool, echoing darkness of the church. The air is thick with the sweet smell of incense and melting beeswax. Light filters through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in jewels of red and blue. And there, at the altar, sits the reliquary, a beautiful case of gold and silver, holding the sacred object. The power in that moment was immense. For the believer, this was no mere sightseeing. It was a profound spiritual experience. The touch of the reliquary, or even just its presence, was believed to have power. It could cure the sick. It could heal the lame and give sight to the blind. It could forgive your sins and shorten your time in purgatory after death. The stories of miracles were everywhere. They were told by priests from the pulpit and whispered from pilgrim to pilgrim along the road. These relics were anchors of hope in a very harsh world. They were proof that God had not forgotten his people, that miracles were still possible, and that a piece of heaven was here with them in their time of need. The desire for that connection was everything. This intense desire created an incredible demand. Every church, every monastery, every king and prince wanted a powerful relic. It brought them prestige. It brought them divine protection. And it brought them pilgrims, whose donations could build magnificent cathedrals and sustain entire towns. The most sought-after relics were those connected to Jesus, the Virgin Mary, or the Apostles. But none held quite the same mystique, or created quite the same confusion as the head of St. John the Baptist. And the story of its most famous claimant begins not in a peaceful church, but in the chaos and violence of a holy war gone terribly wrong. It is a story that brings us to a man named Wallen de Sarton. Wallen de Sarton was a canon, a clerical official from Picardy in northern France. He was also a crusader. He had joined the Fourth Crusade, a massive expedition of European knights and soldiers. Their stated goal was to sail to Egypt, and from there to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. But history rarely follows a straight path. Through a series of complex political deals and crippling debts to the merchants of Venice, the crusade was diverted. Instead of sailing to Muslim Egypt, their fleet of ships turned towards the greatest Christian city in the world. Their new target was the magnificent, sprawling, and fabulously wealthy city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was a city of wonders. For 900 years, it had been the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a city of gilded palaces, enormous churches, and libraries filled with ancient knowledge. But more than that, it was the world's greatest treasure chest of holy relics. While Western Europe was slowly emerging from the Dark Ages, Constantinople had been safely gathering these sacred objects for centuries. It was said to hold the crown of thorns that Jesus wore, the lance that pierced his side, countless pieces of the true cross, and according to its patriarchs, the true head of St. John the Baptist, preserved in the splendor of the imperial palace. The Crusaders, who had come to fight for God, now found themselves at the gates of a Christian city, staring at its unimaginable treasures with envy. In the year 1204, the unthinkable happened. The crusading army broke through the city's legendary walls. What followed was a brutal 3-day sack of the city. The knights and soldiers who had sworn holy vows rampaged through the streets. They were meant to be liberators of the Holy Land, but they became looters. Amid this terrible chaos, our canon, Wallen de Sarton, began his own personal treasure hunt. He later wrote an account of what he found. He claimed that he found a secluded, hidden place away from the main palaces. There, he said, an old priest revealed a secret to him. He was shown a special relic, one kept safe from the main collection. Inside a case, resting on a silver platter, was what he described as a human head, or at least most of it. It was the skull from the eyebrows up, looking like a bowl. There was a small hole above the left eye, which was said to be from the final blow that killed the saint. Wallen de Sarton was convinced. This was it, the true head of John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ. He knew instantly what this discovery meant. It was a treasure beyond any gold or silver he could plunder. It was a piece of history, a direct link to the Gospels. He carefully took the relic, a holy theft in the midst of a worldly one, and prepared to take it home. The journey back to France was not a simple one. The relic could not just be packed in a saddlebag. It had to be treated with the utmost reverence. Wallen organized a procession. He carried his prize back across Europe, and as he traveled, the story grew. This was not just loot from a conquered city. This was a divine prize, rescued from the hands of the schismatic Eastern Greeks and brought to the heart of true Catholic faith in France. The journey itself became a part of the Relic story, its provenance. By the time he reached his home region of Picardy, the news had spread far and wide. A priceless first-class relic was arriving. A wave of excitement and religious fervor swept the land. When Wallen de Sarton finally arrived in the city of Amiens on December 17th, 1206, he was greeted as a hero. The bishop and the people of the city came out in a grand procession to meet him. The relic was paraded through the streets, a symbol of God's immense favor. For the people of Amiens, this was a miracle. Their city, a respectable but unremarkable provincial capital, had just been chosen by God to house one of the most sacred objects in all of Christendom. It was a sign of their piety, a reward for their faith. The relic was placed in their existing cathedral, and almost immediately, stories of miracles began to circulate. The sick were healed. The blind could see. The head of St. John was not just a relic, it was a worker of wonders. The arrival of the relic transformed Amiens forever. The city became a major destination, a star on the map of pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed Europe. An endless river of humanity began to flow towards its gates. These pilgrims needed places to stay, food to eat, and candles to burn. Inns and taverns flourished. Merchants sold provisions and souvenirs, like little lead badges stamped with the image of the saint's head. The entire economy of the city began to revolve around its holy treasure. The head of St. John was more than just a sacred object. It was a powerful engine of commerce, bringing wealth and prosperity on a scale the city had never known before. This prosperity needed a grand statement, a testament to their gratitude and newfound importance. And so, the people of Amiens began to build. In 1220, they laid the foundation stone for a new cathedral. This would not be just any church. It was designed to be the largest, most magnificent Gothic cathedral in all of France. A colossal structure of stone and glass that would soar towards the heavens, a building worthy of housing the head of the Baptist. Its construction was a monumental undertaking, lasting for decades. It was funded almost entirely by the endless stream of donations from the faithful who came to see the relic. The cathedral itself became a testament to the head's power. It was a stone and mortar proclamation that Amiens was a special place, blessed by God and protected by his prophet. Inside the glorious new cathedral, the relic was given a home of breathtaking beauty. The skull was placed upon a grand reliquary. A faceplate of silver gilt was crafted, giving the skull a serene and lifelike visage. Precious jewels and intricate carvings adorned the entire structure. On special feast days, it would be brought out and shown to the masses. The sight of it, gleaming in the candlelight of the vast cathedral, would have been overwhelming. For the people of Amiens, and for the thousands of pilgrims, this was the authentic head of the saint. Its story was clear, its power was proven by miracles, and its value was displayed in the magnificent church built around it. But far to the south, in the heart of Christendom, a different story was being told. Just as Amiens was enjoying its newfound fame, a problem began to surface. It was a quiet murmur at first, then a more insistent voice. The voice came from Rome. The eternal city, the seat of the Pope himself, had a message for the faithful. The relic at Amiens, this prize from the crusade, was an impostor. Because Rome, they claimed, already had the true head of John the Baptist, and it had been there for centuries. The church of San Silvestro in Capet, Saint Sylvester at the head, had long been the keeper of this sacred treasure. For the church in Rome, the claim from Amiens was the work of an upstart, a provincial town flaunting a piece of stolen goods with a fanciful story. The Roman story was one of ancient, stable authority. Their relic, they said, had been brought to the city from the Holy Land long ago, in the 4th century. It had been protected by popes and revered by generations of the Roman faithful long before the First Crusade was ever imagined. Theirs was a quiet, confident claim. They did not need to build a new cathedral to prove its worth. Its worth was guaranteed by its location in the very center of the Catholic world. The relic itself was similar to the one in Amiens, just the top part is skull. But its history, its provenance, was entirely different. It was a relic of old authority, of deep history, standing in silent opposition to the flashy newcomer in France. The conflict presented a confusing picture for the faithful. Who were they to believe? The dynamic French city, with its miracle-working prize from the Crusade, or the ancient, powerful authority of Rome? A devout pilgrim might have to choose which story they trusted more, but the complication did not end there. Far beyond the borders of Catholic Europe, in a land ruled by Muslims, there was another, even older claim. In the great city of Damascus, within the stunning Umayyad Mosque, was another shrine. And this shrine, it was said, also contained the head of St. John the Baptist. This was not a secret or a new discovery. It had been revered there for centuries. This third claim adds a beautiful layer of complexity to the story. John the Baptist is not only a Christian saint, He is also a revered prophet in Islam, where he is known by the name Yahya. The Umayyad Mosque, one of the holiest sites in the Muslim world, was built on the site of a former Christian basilica dedicated to the saint. When the mosque was built, the shrine to the head was preserved. For centuries, it was a place of shared reverence. Muslim scholars wrote of it, and Christian pilgrims from Europe would visit Damascus and pray at the very same shrine. Here, the story of the saint's head transcended the conflict between the two great religions. So now, our picture is complete. We have three cities hundreds of miles apart: Amiens, Rome, and Damascus. One Catholic, one Orthodox by tradition, and one Islamic. Each city possessed a major shrine. Each shrine claimed to hold the one true head of St. John the Baptist. And in each city, the relic was deeply revered, drawing believers who were certain that their head was the authentic one. This situation seems almost comical from our modern perspective. How could so many believe in something so contradictory? And these were just the major contenders. The competition for the Baptist's remains had spread far and wide, resulting in a confusing collection of smaller, but still revered, body parts. Other churches across Europe claimed to have smaller, but still significant pieces. The city of Munich in Germany also claimed to have a head of the saint. Another church claimed to possess his jawbone. Another, a piece of his scalp. It seemed that in the great spiritual marketplace of the Middle Ages, there were more than enough pieces of John the Baptist to go around. It raises a fundamental question. Was everyone simply being fooled? Was this a case of mass delusion, spanning continents and religions? Or was something else going on? Did the church authorities in Rome and Amiens know they were promoting rival claims? The evidence suggests that they did, but they let the contradiction stand. To understand why, we must look deeper. We must move past the simple question of which head was real, because for the medieval world, that may not have been the most important question. The story of these relics is not just a story of faith. It is a story of power, money, and the deep human need for a tangible connection to the divine. The existence of three heads of the same saint is not a quirky footnote in history. It is a key that can unlock the secret world of the relic trade. It reveals a system where faith was a currency, and the bones of saints were the assets of kings and popes. And so, we are left with a profound mystery. How could a world so deeply invested in the truth of religion tolerate such an obvious falsehood at its heart? Were the people of the Middle Ages simply more gullible than we are today? Or did they understand something about belief that we have forgotten? As we continue our journey into the shadows, the answers we find are more unsettling and more fascinating than the mystery itself. For those of you still with me, the story only gets darker from here. We must now leave the grand cathedrals and the public processions. Our next stop is a much quieter, more secretive place. We must step into the forger's workshop. Now the great cathedrals have faded from our view. The noise of the crowds has fallen silent. We now find ourselves in a quieter, more contemplative place. Imagine a monastery nestled in a rolling valley in Burgundy. The air here is still. The only sounds are the distant tolling of a bell, the scratching of a pen on vellum, and the soft chant of prayer echoing from the chapel. Life here is governed by order, piety, and devotion. But within these sacred walls, in a dusty workshop, hidden from prying eyes, a different kind of devotion is taking place. It is a craft both holy and heretical. Here, we will meet the architect of these beautiful lies, the relic forger. Let us give him a name, Brother Thomas. He is not a monster or a simple con man. He is a quiet, thoughtful man with gifted hands. In the monastery, he is known for his skill in illuminating manuscripts, his steady hand in repairing broken statues. He is pious. He attends every prayer, observes every fast. But he is also a pragmatist. He sees the world with clear eyes, and he understands that faith, as beautiful as it is, cannot fix a leaking roof or feed the hungry who come to the monastery gates for a loaf of bread. He is a man caught between the spiritual ideal and the harsh reality of survival. A man who has found a unique way to serve both. His motivations are a complex tapestry of faith and cynicism. His monastery is old, and it is poor. The winter winds whistle through cracks in the stone walls. The rains have rotted the beams in the granary. The abbot prays for a miracle, for a wealthy patron to notice their plight. Brother Thomas has decided to create that miracle himself. This is the world of pia fraus, a Latin phrase meaning pious fraud. He tells himself that the deception serves a greater good. A skillfully made relic will bring pilgrims. Pilgrims will bring donations. Donations will save his monastery and allow them to continue their good work. Is it a sin to create a beautiful lie if that lie inspires true faith in others? In the quiet of his workshop, Brother Thomas wrestles with this question. Or perhaps he has long since made his peace with it. He may see his work as a form of divine art. He is creating a physical focus for people's prayers. If a simple woman from a nearby village prays to a piece of bone he has aged, and her prayer is answered, who is to say the miracle is not real? The faith it inspired was real. The comfort it provided was real. Perhaps God, in his infinite wisdom, can work through any object, authentic or not. Brother Thomas might see himself not as a forger, but as a facilitator of faith, a craftsman in the service of God's mysterious will. He is simply building a more beautiful stage for the drama. Of belief to unfold, his work begins not with carving or painting, but with scavenging. The raw materials for a holy relic must be chosen with care. They must have a history, a texture, a feeling of age that cannot be easily faked. He finds his materials in the forgotten corners of the world. Down in the monastery's own ossuary, the crypt where the bones of monks from centuries past are neatly stacked, he can find his supply. An anonymous thigh bone, a forgotten skull. These men died in piety. What better final service than to be elevated to sainthood, to continue to serve the monastery even in death? He gives them a new story, a new, more glorious identity. He also looks beyond the monastery walls. An old abandoned plague pit on a hillside is a somber treasure trove. The bones there have already been aged by the earth itself. For wood, he seeks out ancient sources. A beam from a collapsed Roman ruin has the tight grain of old-growth timber. A piece of an old, broken wine press has been stained dark by decades of juice and time. These pieces of wood are perfect candidates to become fragments of the true cross or the staff of an apostle. He gathers these humble, forgotten things. He sees not what they are, but what they could become. He is an alchemist of history, turning the mundane into the sacred. Now, the true craft begins. We watch over his shoulder as he prepares his first piece. He has selected a human finger bone from the crypt. It is yellowed, but it does not yet look like it has lain in a Palestinian tomb for over 1,000 years. The work must be subtle, and it must be patient. First, he cleans it meticulously. Then, he might boil it in water with specific herbs. This not only cleanses it, but also leaches out any remaining marrow, making the bone feel lighter, older, more brittle. This is the foundation. He is stripping the bone of its recent past, preparing the canvas for a much more ancient story. The air in his workshop fills with the strange, earthy smell of his work. The next step is to give the bone its color, its patina of age. This is an art form in itself. He prepares a dye, not from anything artificial, but from the natural world. He might boil the bone in a pot with dark tea leaves, or with crushed walnut shells. This slowly, gently stains the bone a deep, convincing brown. It is not a uniform color, but mottled and uneven, just as it would be if it had aged naturally. After staining, he will bury it for a time. He might place it in a box of damp soil, mixed with iron shavings. The moisture and rust will continue the work, creating small, dark spots and a feeling of having been drawn from the earth. He is a student of time. He knows that age is not just about color. It is also about texture and wear. He takes the stained bone and begins the slow process of physical aging. He does not use a hammer or a chisel. The damage would look too fresh, too deliberate. Instead, he might place the bone in a leather pouch with sand and small pebbles. For hours, while he works on other things, he will shake the pouch or tumble it in his hands. This process gently wears down the sharp edges. It creates microscopic scratches and pits. It mimics the slow, patient abrasion of centuries. It is a form of controlled, accelerated erosion. To complete the effect, he might use a fine knife to carve small, almost invisible marks. He might chip one end slightly, as if it had been broken from a larger piece. Then he rubs the bone with beeswax, mixed with a bit of soot from the fire. This fills the tiny cracks and scratches, highlighting them in a way that suggests they are ancient. It also gives the bone a faint luster, a smoothness that speaks of being handled, touched, and venerated by countless hands over many generations. When he is finished, the simple, anonymous finger bone is gone. In its place is a relic that looks, feels, and even smells ancient. It is ready for its story, The same artistry is applied to wood. He takes a piece of that ancient Roman beam. He knows that a simple splinter will not be convincing. He must understand how wood ages. He might soak it in brine to draw out the moisture and simulate the effects of sea travel. He might leave it near a termite mound for a few weeks, allowing the insects to carve their own intricate patterns into its surface. He bakes it slowly near the fire, not enough to burn it, but enough to make it brittle and to create fine, spidery cracks in the grain. Each piece of true cross he creates is a masterpiece of decay, a perfect imitation of the slow, relentless work of time. This process could take weeks or even months. It is a slow, meditative craft. It requires immense patience and an eye for the smallest details. Rushing the work is the surest way to be discovered. Every step is designed to build layers of authenticity, to create an object that disarms skepticism on a sensory level. Before a scholar even has a chance to question its story, the pilgrim has already seen and felt its age. The relic's appearance becomes its own primary evidence. It speaks a silent, convincing language of its own. It whispers of its long journey. Through the centuries, even though its journey only began a few months ago, in this small, dusty workshop. He applies this same painstaking care to textiles. To create a fragment of the Virgin Mary's veil or a piece of a martyr's tunic, he begins with old hand-spun linen. New cloth would be too perfect, too uniform. He frays the edges carefully with a stone, not a knife, to avoid a clean cut. He then stains the cloth. A touch of saffron will give it a golden, aged hue. A small, carefully placed drop of red wine can simulate a bloodstain that has faded over centuries. He might leave it out in the sun and the damp, allowing mold and mildew to create their own subtle patterns. The final product is a piece of cloth that looks impossibly fragile. An incredibly ancient dot, the forger's art extended to even more challenging substances. Vials of a saint's blood were highly prized. To create this, Brother Thomas could not use real human blood, as it would quickly decay and reveal the fraud. Instead, he might use animal blood, carefully mixed with a dark reddish tree resin. Like dragon's blood, this substance acted as a preservative and gave the liquid a thick syrupy quality that looked ancient and mysterious. Even more popular was the supposed milk of the Virgin Mary. This was often a simple but clever concoction of powdered white chalk or lead white, mixed with egg whites or a thin gum arabic, sealed inside a tiny glass vial. It created a permanent, milky liquid that would never spoil. The physical object is now complete. It sits on his workbench, a masterpiece of artificial age. It is a silent, compelling lie. But Brother Thomas knows that his work is only half finished. The most beautiful. Forgery in the world is useless without an equally beautiful story. An object cannot speak for itself. It needs a voice. It needs a history. It needs a provenance. And so, Brother Thomas the craftsman puts away his tools. He picks up a quill and ink. He must now become Brother Thomas the storyteller. The creation of the relic's history was an art form just as demanding as the creation of the relic itself. Provenance is a word for an object's life story. It is the chain of ownership, the narrative that traces it back to its sacred origin. Without a convincing provenance, the finger bone is just a bone. The splinter of wood is just a splinter. The story is what breathes life into the object. It is what transforms it from a curiosity into a conduit of divine power. And so, the forger had to be as skilled a writer as he was a craftsman. He had to weave a tale that was both believable and inspiring. A story that could capture the hearts and minds of the faithful and quiet the doubts of the skeptical. The story often began with a miraculous discovery. Brother Thomas might write a tale of how an old pious monk in his monastery was visited. In a dream. In the dream, a saint would appear, telling the monk where to dig in the churchyard to find a long-lost relic. The next morning, the monks would dig at that very spot, and miraculously, they would unearth the relic that Brother Thomas had planted there just a few nights before. This kind of story was perfect. It was impossible to disprove, and it immediately gave the relic an origin steeped in divine intervention. It wasn't just found. It was revealed by heaven itself. The narrative would be filled with rich details. The story of the relic might include tales of how it had been hidden for centuries, to protect it from Viking raiders or from heretics. It might be described as having been owned by a famous bishop, or having been present at a great battle, protecting the faithful. These layers of story added to its perceived authenticity and power. The forger would often write this story down. In a short manuscript, a little book called a Vita, or a life of the relic. This book would be kept with the relic, and the story would be told and retold until it became an inseparable part of the object. The story made the relic real, but the most sophisticated forgers knew that a good story was not always enough. For a truly important relic, one that could attract wealthy patrons or the favor of a king, you needed paperwork. You needed documents that looked official. You needed proof that the church itself recognized the relic as authentic. This is where the forger's skill reached its peak. He had to become an expert in creating false documents. This required deep understanding of history, language, and the bureaucratic methods of the church. It was a dangerous, but highly rewarded, part of the craft. First, he needed to create the parchment itself. Making new parchment look centuries old was a delicate process. He would take a fresh piece of sheepskin vellum and soak it in a weak solution of tea or water stained with soil. This would remove the stark whiteness of the new material. He would then hang it in the sun for several days, which would make it brittle. To create the feel of a much-handled document, he might gently rub the surface with a pumice stone, thinning it in places, and softening the texture. He might even fold it repeatedly, or roll it tightly into a scroll and press it under a weight, to create the permanent creases of a document that had been stored for ages. Once the parchment was prepared, he had to forge the writing. This required incredible skill. He couldn't just write a letter from a long-dead pope. He had to write it in the specific style of script, or hand, used by the papal court in that exact century. He would study genuine documents, copying the unique way a scribe formed each letter, the abbreviations they used, the standard phrases of greeting and closing. The language had to be perfect. The Latin had to be correct for the period. It was like being a historical method actor, immersing himself completely in the mind of a 13th century scribe. The final touch, the masterstroke of the forgery, was the seal. Official documents were authenticated with a wax or lead seal, stamped with the unique insignia of a pope or a bishop. A forger like Brother Thomas would need to be a skilled engraver. He would carefully carve a replica of a real seal into a piece of stone or hard metal. This mold had to be perfect. Then he would melt lead or beeswax, press it into the mold, and attach the newly minted fake seal to the bottom of his forged document. With this seal, the deception was complete. He now had not just a relic, and not just a story, but a piece of official-looking history, a document that could silence almost any critic. Now that the product was complete, with its physical form, its story, and its paperwork, how did it enter the world? The forger rarely sold his own work. That would be far too suspicious. Instead, a complex and often unspoken distribution network was used. A monastery like Brother Thomas's might simply discover its new relic, as we've heard. The abbot would announce the miraculous dream, the monks would dig, and the relic would be found. No one would suspect the quiet, humble Brother Thomas, who was likely leading the choir in a hymn of praise at the discovery. For relics intended for other churches, the process was more subtle. An abbot from a visiting monastery might be gifted a minor relic as a sign of friendship. He would take it home, his own reputation lending it authenticity. More often, the forger would use a middleman, a traveling merchant, or a knight returning from a pilgrimage or crusade was the perfect cover. These men could plausibly claim to have purchased the relic in a faraway market, or received it from a holy man in the East. They would sell the relic to a church for a handsome price, and the forger would get his share. The object's journey through a middleman added another layer of authenticity, obscuring its true, humble origins in the workshop. For those still listening closely, you can almost hear the quiet whisper in the cloister, the rustle of a forged document, the silent transaction that could change a town's destiny forever. The forger's workshop provided the supply, a steady stream of skillfully crafted bones, woods, and textiles, all wrapped in beautiful stories and clever paperwork. But this small-scale supply could never have sustained the immense industry of relics on its own. It required a massive, continent-wide explosion in demand, and that demand would be fueled by one of the most dramatic and consequential events of the Middle Ages, turning the quiet trickle of forgeries into a roaring flood. Part 3. Heists, Crusades, and Holy Lies, we leave the quiet workshop of Brother Thomas, with its smells of old wood and drying herbs. We now step onto the world stage, a grand theater of politics, power, and war. In this arena, holy relics were more than just objects of faith. They were instruments of diplomacy, justifications for conquest, and the ultimate symbols of legitimacy. The forgers, in their secret cells, had perfected the art of creating the supply. But for a trade to truly explode, it needs a surge in demand, and a catastrophic event that blurs the line between the real and the fake. That event would be a holy war, turned against the very heart of Christendom, and it would unleash the greatest relic. Heist in History. Our story now takes us to the Golden City, Constantinople. For 1,000 years, it had stood as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire. To the knights and peasants of Western Europe, living in their drafty castles and muddy villages, Constantinople was a legend, a city of impossible wealth and sophistication. Its markets overflowed with silk from China and spices from India. Its libraries held the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. Its great avenues were lined with marble statues and magnificent palaces, their roofs gleaming like solid gold under the sun. It was the center of the world, a city protected by God himself. At the very heart of this great city stood a building that seemed to defy the laws of physics and gravity, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Imagine stepping inside. Your eyes are drawn upwards to a colossal dome that seems to float. Unsupported, a golden bowl of heaven resting on the building. The sunlight, pouring through a ring of windows at its base, illuminates a vast, open space. The walls are not bare stone, but are covered in shimmering mosaics. Millions of tiny pieces of colored glass and gold leaf form images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. The air echoes with the sound of Greek chants. To enter the Hagia Sophia was to feel that you had stepped out of the world and into paradise. This city and this church were the world's greatest museum of the holy. For centuries, while Western Europe was fractured and unstable, the emperors of Byzantium had used their immense wealth and power to collect the most sacred relics of the Christian faith. They were brought from Jerusalem, from Antioch, from Ephesus. This was not a haphazard collection. It was a systematic imperial project. The relics were housed in the city's hundreds of churches and private chapels, protected within reliquaries of astounding beauty. They were the spiritual treasury of the empire, a testament to its direct connection to the age of the apostles. They were the empire's ultimate claim to legitimacy. The list of relics held within Constantinople's walls reads like a catalogue of heaven itself. The city possessed the crown of thorns, which had been placed upon the head of Jesus. It held the holy lance, the spear that pierced his side. There were vials of his blood, his baby clothes, and the very tiles he had stood upon. The city held the Mandeline, a cloth said to bear a miraculous image of Christ's face. And of course, multiple churches and monasteries within the city walls. claimed to possess large parts of the true cross. These were not just objects of reverence. They were sources of immense power, the spiritual palladiums that were believed to keep the city and the empire safe from all its enemies. But an enemy was coming that no one had predicted. By the early 13th century, the relationship between the Greek-speaking Christians of Constantinople and the Latin-speaking Christians of the West was deeply strained. They followed different rites, were led by different patriarchs, and viewed each other with deep suspicion. So when the Knights of the Fourth Crusade arrived outside the city's massive walls, they were not seen as brothers in Christ, but as dangerous, unpredictable barbarians. These crusaders, who had set out to fight for God, were now staring at the wealth of the Golden City, and their gaze was turning from reverence to greed. A storm was about to break Dot in the fateful year of 1204. The storm hit. The crusading army, with the help of the Venetian fleet, breached the city's legendary sea walls. For the first time in 900 years, Constantinople had fallen to an invading army, a Christian army. The shock and horror that rippled through the city is impossible to overstate. The order of the world had been turned upside down. What followed was 3 days of horrific violence and looting. But this was more than just a military sack. It was a frantic, systematic treasure hunt, carried out by thousands of men who believed. They were not just enriching themselves, but also claiming a spiritual inheritance. While common soldiers grabbed jewels and melted down statues, the noblemen and high-ranking clergy on the crusade had their eyes on a greater prize. They knew the legends. They knew what treasures the city's churches held. This was their chance to acquire relics of a quality unimaginable in the West. With the city in chaos, they led organized raids on churches, monasteries, and the imperial palace itself. They broke into sanctuaries that had been sealed for centuries. They forced local priests to reveal their secret hiding places. It was a holy feeding frenzy, a desperate grab for the sacred treasures of the fallen empire. We can picture the scene. A French knight, his sword still stained from battle, breaking down the gilded door to a palace chapel. A Venetian sea captain, stuffing a precious silk burial shroud into his tunic. And clerics, men of God, directing the plunder. The Bishop of Soissons, whom we have met before, seized the relic that would later be celebrated in Amiens as the head of John the Baptist. Another French bishop took 2 pieces of the true cross, the head of St. Stephen and the arm of St. George. The list goes on and on. It was a systematic stripping of a civilization's spiritual heritage, all done under the banner of the cross. The beautiful, intricate reliquaries were often destroyed on the spot. They were smashed apart with axes and hammers, their gold and silver panels stolen, their precious gems pried out. The relics themselves, the humble bones and scraps of cloth, were simply pocketed. The value was not in the art, but in the raw materials and the sacred contents. An ancient, priceless manuscript might be stripped of its jeweled cover, the book itself discarded or used to kindle a fire. It was a tragedy of cultural destruction, driven by a combination of greed and a twisted sense of pious righteousness. The Crusaders believed they were liberating these relics from the Greeks, whom they considered heretics. The result of this three-day plunder was a tidal wave of holy objects, both genuine and dubious, that washed over Western Europe. Before 1204, only the greatest kings and cathedrals could hope to own a relic of the highest class. After the sack, everything was on the market. The loot was so vast that it had to be divided formally among the leaders of the crusade. A knight who had once prayed in a simple stone chapel at home might now find himself the owner of a finger of an apostle. A small monastery in Flanders could suddenly acquire a piece of the true cross. This event, more than any other, supercharged the relic trade. It created a flood of new items on the market, which in turn created cover for forgers. Who could tell if a piece of the true cross was genuine when hundreds of new pieces were suddenly available? It completely blurred the lines between a real relic, a stolen relic, and a fake one. The story of an object's origin became much easier to invent. A forger no longer needed a complex tale of a dream or a vision. He could simply say his relic came from the plunder of Constantinople. It was a plausible and often true explanation that was almost impossible to verify. The great heist had thrown the market into chaos, and in that chaos, the forgers thrived. Asterisk. The ships that sailed back to Venice and other European ports were laden with a strange and precious cargo. Alongside silks and spices, they carried the bones of martyrs and the wood of the cross. Each successful return was a victory. Each relic brought back was a seed. When planted in the soil of a French cathedral or a German monastery, it would grow into a new pilgrimage site with its own stories, its own miracles, and its own stream of revenue. The sack of Constantinople was a tragedy for the East, but for the West, it was a spiritual and economic stimulus package of incredible proportions. It was a redistribution of heavenly treasure. This sudden influx of holy objects changed the religious landscape of Europe. Before, a local church might have had a simple piece of cloth touched to a shrine in Rome. Now, that same church might possess a tooth of St. George or a fragment of the manger from Bethlehem, liberated from a chapel. In Constantinople, this democratization of holiness created a new wave of religious excitement. Communities across the continent began building new, more elaborate churches to house their newfound treasures. The competition for pilgrims grew more intense, and the stories of miracles became more elaborate. The great heist had provided the inventory for a boom in the business of faith. While countless relics were taken by force and spread across Europe in a chaotic frenzy, the single most famous relic of Constantinople was transferred in a different way. It was not stolen in the heat of battle. It was sold in a calm and calculated transaction between two kings. This sale represents the ultimate expression of relics as instruments of state power. It is a story not of a simple knight or a cunning forger, but of a saintly king who saw an opportunity to purchase not just a holy object, but the spiritual destiny of his entire kingdom. This king was Louis IX of France. Louis IX, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis, was a man of extraordinary piety and sharp political instincts. He watched the chaos unfolding in the East with great interest. The new Latin Empire of Constantinople, founded by the Crusaders, was incredibly weak and desperately poor. Its emperor, a young man named Baldwin II, was an emperor in name. Only, he ruled over a city that was a shadow of its former self. He had no money to pay his soldiers or repair the city walls. So he began to do the unthinkable. He began to sell the city's sacred inheritance. His greatest asset, his final bargaining chip, was the crown of thorns. The crown of thorns was the ultimate relic of the Passion of Christ. The Byzantine emperors had guarded it for centuries. Now, Baldwin was forced to use it as collateral for a loan from Venetian bankers. When he couldn't repay the loan, the crown was in danger of being sold to the highest bidder. King Louis saw his chance. He entered into negotiations, not with the bankers, but with Baldwin himself. The price was staggering. 135,000 livres. This was more than half of the entire yearly revenue of the French kingdom. It was an amount of money that could have funded an army or built a fleet of ships. For Louis, it was worth every coin. When the crown finally arrived in France in the year 1239, its reception was a masterpiece of political theater. Louis did not receive it dressed in his royal robes. Instead, he and his brother met the procession outside of Paris. There, the King of France removed his crown, his shoes, and his fine clothes. Dressed as a humble barefoot penitent, he himself helped carry the precious relic into the city. The message this sent was powerful and clear. The king was not just a ruler. He was the humble servant of Christ, the chief protector of the faith. The most powerful monarch in Europe was bowing before this sacred object that, by acquiring the crown of thorns, Louis had performed a spiritual coup. The kingdom of France was now the new Holy Land. It was the possessor of the most precious object in Christendom. This act elevated the French monarchy to a status above all other kings. They were God's chosen rulers, the guardians of Christ's own crown. It was a claim to legitimacy that no amount of military victory could ever buy. Louis later acquired other Passion relics from Baldwin, including a large piece of the True Cross and the Holy Lance. He had effectively purchased the spiritual heritage of Constantinople and moved it to Paris. His capital was now the New Jerusalem. To house these unparalleled treasures, Louis commissioned a building of unique and breathtaking beauty. It was not a large public cathedral, but an intimate royal chapel built within the palace complex. It is called Sainte-Chapelle. It was designed to be nothing less than a giant human-sized reliquary. Its ground floor was for the palace staff, but the upper chapel, where the relics were held, is a wonder of the world. It has almost no solid walls. Instead, towering walls of stained glass rise to the ceiling, depicting the entire story of the Bible. Standing inside on a sunny day is like standing inside a giant jewel, a heavenly chamber of light and color, built to glorify the king's holy possessions. The story of Louis IX is the grandest example, but he was not the first ruler to understand the political power of relics. Centuries earlier, the great Emperor Charlemagne had systematically collected relics to add spiritual legitimacy to his newly forged Holy Roman Empire. He established his capital at Aachen and built a great chapel to house his collection, including what was claimed to be the cloak of Saint Martin. Rulers understood that possessing the bones of a powerful saint was like having that saint as a permanent political ally. It was a way of grounding their earthly power in the unshakable authority of heaven. This power extended onto the battlefield. Relics were often carried into battle as sacred standards or talismans. The kings of France fought under the oriflamme, a sacred banner that was said to have been given to them by an angel. They believed that its presence guaranteed God's favor and would lead them to victory. To fight alongside a relic was to fight alongside the saint himself. It transformed a simple political conflict into a holy war, inspiring soldiers to acts of incredible bravery. A kingdom's collection of relics was not just a spiritual treasury. It was a divine armory docked beyond the battlefield. Relics were central to law and diplomacy. In a world with no modern contracts, the most binding promise that could be made was an oath sworn upon a holy relic. Knights swore oaths of fealty to their lords with their hand placed upon a reliquary. Kings would seal treaties with one another by swearing on their most powerful relics. To break such an oath was not just a political betrayal. It was a mortal sin. It was a direct insult to the saint and an invitation for divine punishment. Relics were the ultimate guarantors of trust, the holy glue that held the fragile political structures of the Middle Ages together. The world of the Middle Ages was a tangled web of faith and power, of piety and politics. The lines we draw today between church and state were almost completely invisible. A king's power was justified by divine will, and the church wielded immense earthly power. And at the very center of this web, holding it all together, was the holy relic. It was a spiritual object, a political tool, a military asset, and an economic engine. But all of this power, all of this wealth, depended on one single thing: the unwavering belief of the common person. And if you've journeyed this far with us tonight, perhaps you've wondered the same thing. Why did they believe so fiercely? The answer lies not in royal vaults, but within the landscape of the human heart itself. Our journey is nearing its end. We have walked through the grand cathedrals and crept into the forger's hidden workshop. We have stood on the smoking walls of Constantinople and knelt in the king's private chapel. We have seen how the bones of saints became the treasures of empires. But now we must turn away from the world of power and politics. We must ask the final and most human question of all. Why? Why did people believe so desperately? Why did a peasant farmer walk 1,000 miles to see a piece of wood? Why did a queen pray to a fragment of bone? The answer has little to do with forgery or theft. It has everything to do with the unchanging landscape of the human heart. Faith, for many people, can be a difficult and abstract thing. God, heaven, eternity. These are vast concepts, hard to grasp, hard to hold on to in a world of mud and toil. The Holy Relic closed that distance. It made the abstract into something concrete. It made the divine something tangible. Think of it. This way, you can read stories about a grandparent you never met, but holding a photograph of their face or a letter they wrote in their own hand creates a completely different kind of connection. It makes them real. A relic did the same thing for the saints, and for God, it was a physical remnant, a proof that they had walked the earth, and a sign that they were still present. Imagine again that peasant farmer. His life is hard. His hands are calloused from work. He has seen sickness and sorrow. He has walked for weeks and has finally arrived at the shrine. As he reaches out and touches the cold metal of the reliquary, he is not thinking about historical authenticity. He is thinking about his sick child at home. He is praying for a good harvest. He is seeking a moment of grace in a difficult life. In that moment, he is not just touching an object. He is touching a story. He is touching hope. The relic was a bridge between his small, fragile world and the immense, comforting power of heaven. It was a place to anchor his faith. This need for comfort was overwhelming in the medieval world. Life was often short and full of dangers seen and unseen. Plagues could wipe out a village. Famines could sweep across the land. War was a constant threat. In such a world, a powerful relic was a profound source of security and solace. It was a divine shield for your city, a heavenly guardian for your family. The belief that a saint was personally watching over your town provided a psychological comfort that was more powerful than any medicine. The faith invested in the relic was its own kind of miracle, providing strength and resilience to people who had very little else. The relic also served as a focal point for devotion. Prayer can be a difficult discipline. The mind can wander. By focusing on a physical object, a believer could concentrate their thoughts, their hopes, and their sorrows. The reliquary became a vessel for human emotion. A person could pour out their heart to the relic, confess their sins, and whisper their deepest wishes. It was a constant, silent listener. In a world that was often chaotic and loud, the shrine offered a place of quiet contemplation, a sacred space where an individual could feel seen and heard by the divine. It provided a sense of peace, a momentary escape from the struggles of daily existence. This experience was heightened by all the senses. Belief was not just an intellectual exercise. It was a full-body experience. The journey to the shrine was physical and arduous. Upon arrival, the senses were flooded. The eyes were dazzled by the gleam of gold and the rich colors of stained glass. The ears were filled with the sound of soaring chants and echoing prayers. The nose smelled the thick, sweet perfume of incense. And finally, the hand felt the cool, solid reality of the stone altar or the metal reliquary. All of these sensory inputs worked together to create an overwhelming feeling of sacredness, an atmosphere where belief felt natural and doubt felt out of place. But the power of the relic came not just from the object itself. It came from the story it told. In many cases, the story was more real and more important than the thing. The tales of the saint's life, their sacrifices, their courage, their kindness. The dramatic story of how the relic was discovered. The inspiring accounts of the miracles it had performed for others. These narratives are what gave the relic its true power. An anonymous bone is just a bone, but a bone that belonged to a saint who healed the sick and stood up to tyrants. That is an object of incredible charisma. People did not just venerate the object. They venerated the story it represented. This power of story was amplified by the power of collective belief. Humans are social creatures. We find comfort and certainty in shared truths. In the Middle Ages, belief in the local relic was a cornerstone of community identity. Your family believed in it. Your neighbors believed in it. The priest proclaimed its power from the pulpit. The lord of the land bowed before it. To doubt the relic was not just a private, intellectual act. It was an act of separation. It was to stand apart from your entire community, from your entire culture. The social pressure to believe was immense. But it was not always felt as pressure. It was felt as a warm, comforting sense of belonging. The act of pilgrimage was a powerful ritual that strengthened this shared belief. Imagine walking the road to a famous shrine. You are not walking alone. You are part of a river of people, all moving in the same direction, all driven by the same purpose. You share food, you share stories of why you are traveling. You hear from others about the miracles they hope to receive. When you finally arrive, you arrive as part of a great crowd, your individual voice joining a massive chorus of prayer. This shared experience created an incredible bond. It confirmed that your personal faith was part of a much larger, undeniable truth. The belief of each person amplified the belief of everyone else. We can also understand this persistence of faith through a psychological lens. When a person makes a great sacrifice for something, their mind needs to believe that the sacrifice was worthwhile. Think of the pilgrim who has given up his time, his comfort, and what little money he has to reach. A shrine. It is psychologically much easier for him to believe with all his heart in the power of the relic than to face the crushing disappointment that it might be a fraud. To protect itself from this pain, the mind will often strengthen its belief. The greater the investment, the more fervent the faith becomes. It is a way the heart protects itself. And so, It may be that the authenticity of the object was rarely the point. The object was a vessel. It was a container for so many things. It held the community's identity. It held a person's desperate hope for a miracle. It held the weight of a long and difficult journey. The relic became powerful because people poured their own faith, their own stories, and their own hearts into it. Whether the bone came from a saint or from a forgotten grave became secondary. Its true power was accrued over time through the accumulated devotion of the thousands of people who had prayed before it. It became holy because it was treated as holy. In this light, the forger, Brother Thomas, appears in a different context. Perhaps he understood this principle better than anyone. He was not just faking an object. He was creating a new vessel, a new container for people's faith. He was building a new focal point for hope. When he carefully aged a piece of wood, he was not just creating a fake. He was creating the physical embodiment of a story that he knew would bring comfort and meaning to others. His work was a deception, yes, but it was a deception that fed a deep and profoundly human need, a need for connection, for meaning, and for hope in a world that often offered very little of each. The true power, then, was a kind of spiritual alchemy. It was a joint creation, a partnership between the object, its story, and the heart of the believer. The relic was the catalyst. It was the physical anchor point. But the real miracle was the act of belief itself. The immense energy of human hope, faith, and desperation focused on a single point. This collective energy was a real force in the world. It could provide real comfort. It could inspire real courage. And it could build real cathedrals of stone and light. The question of the object's origin almost ceases to matter in the face of such power. For centuries, this intricate dance of faith and object continued, but nothing lasts forever. In the 16th century, a great shift in thinking began to sweep across Europe. It was called the Reformation. New voices, led by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, began to challenge the authority of the Pope and the long-held traditions of the Church. And one of their primary targets for criticism was the entire system of holy relics. They saw it not as a beautiful expression of faith, but as a dangerous and corrupt form of superstition, a practice that led people away from true devotion to God. These reformers pointed to the obvious absurdities of the relic trade as proof of its corruption. John Calvin famously wrote an entire book on relics. He mocked the idea that there could be 3 heads of John the Baptist. He listed the countless pieces of the true cross, calculating that if they were all gathered together, they would fill an entire ship. For the reformers, these objects were not conduits to heaven. They were tools of deception, used by a cynical church to exploit the faith of the common people for money and power. They called for a simpler, more direct faith, one based on Scripture alone, with no need for saints or their bones. This theological battle did not remain a war of words. In many parts of Northern Europe, it spilled out into the streets. A wave of iconoclasm, or image breaking, took place. Mobs and sometimes government officials entered the great churches and cathedrals. They smashed the statues of the saints. They tore down the stained glass windows, and they seized the holy reliquaries. They broke them open, exposing the bones and dust within. They burned the relics in great bonfires in the town square. For them, this was not an act of destruction. It was an act of purification, a cleansing of the church from the sins of idolatry. It was a sad and violent end to an entire age of belief. And so, the great age of relics came to a close. The world moved on. Science began to provide new explanations for the world and new remedies for sickness. But have we truly left this way of thinking behind? Or has that deep human need for a tangible connection to the things we value simply changed its form? We may no longer pray to the bones of saints, but we still collect our own kinds of relics. We still invest in inanimate objects with a power and a meaning that goes far beyond their material properties. Our world is still full of them, if we know where to look. Think of a museum. We stand quietly behind a velvet rope, looking at a pen used to sign a historic treaty, or a dress worn by a beloved celebrity. These objects hold a certain magic for us. We know they are just ink and metal, silk and thread, but they were there. They touched a person, a moment that we consider important. They act as a bridge across time, a tangible link to a story we cherish. The same is true in our own lives. A sports fan might treasure a signed baseball. A music lover might frame a ticket stub from a concert that changed their life. We all do this. And as you rest now, letting these stories wash over you, you might notice how we all collect our own small, personal relics. A smooth stone from a beach where you were happy. A faded photograph of someone you love. A worn-out book from your childhood. These things are not famous. They are not covered in gold or jewels. But they hold a power for us that is real and true. They are anchors for our memories, containers for our love. They tell the story of who we are and of what we hold sacred. This deep human instinct, this need to make memory and meaning tangible, is the same instinct that built the great cathedrals of Europe. And so we come to the end of our story. The dark truth about medieval holy relics is not a simple tale of cynical forgers and gullible believers. It is a much more complex and human story. It is a story about the desperate need for hope in a harsh world. It is a story about the incredible power of a shared belief. And it is a story about the blurred line between faith and falsehood, where a beautiful lie can sometimes create a comforting truth. The forgers and the crusaders, the kings and the pilgrims, were all caught in this intricate web. In the end, the medieval world was filled with beautiful, intricate containers, reliquaries of gold and silver, designed to hold bone and dust. But perhaps the most intricate container of all is the human heart. It has the capacity to hold, all at once, doubt and devotion, sorrow and hope. It can hold a deep understanding of the world's harsh realities, and at the same time, an infinite capacity for belief in something more. It is this capacity that allows us to find meaning and to create beauty and to find peace, even in the darkest of nights. The line between a treasured memory and a holy relic, between a comforting story and the absolute truth, can be as thin as a sleeping breath. It is the story we choose to believe in that gives our lives shape and meaning. And it is the hope for a little bit of grace, a little bit of magic in a mundane world that connects us all. It connects us to the peasant farmer kneeling in Amiens, and to the king walking barefoot through the streets of Paris. It is a timeless human story. And now, our story is over. Sleep well.